It's not good news this morning, I'm afraid, guys, particularly if your pension's invested in a passive index fund, which I fear 90% of the people who regularly watch this channel would be in that position. But in my last video, I talked about the importance of using replicating funds rather than synthetic funds when choosing a passive index fund for your pension investments. And this news may just turn that whole thing on its head, really. So to recap, if you buy a replicating index fund, say with Vanguard, they'll actually go out and buy the shares in the companies for the index that you chose. If you choose a synthetic fund, however, this won't happen. The fund manager will set up some complex derivatives that will try to emulate the index that you actually really wanted to invest in. It's going to become really expensive to invest in these passive replicating index funds following this morning's news, sadly. It comes from an article just published in the Financial Times in the UK that says that US regulators could enforce ownership caps, which will raise costs for index tracking funds. So Vanguard has alerted its investors that US regulators might actually limit the size of stakes in companies, which will potentially increase the cost and risk of some of the world's largest index tracking funds. As of May, Vanguard was the world's second largest asset manager, and it had 9.3 trillion in assets. And updated disclosures for numerous funds emphasise the heightened risk of being compelled to adhere to long-standing but seldom enforced caps on individual bank and utility stock ownership. Vanguard, along with fellow passive investment giants such as BlackRock and State Street, they've faced criticisms for their substantial size and voting records on climate and social issues. In January, passively managed US funds surpassed actively managed counterparts in assets under management for the first time. And progressive activists have long raised concerns about the influence of large passive investment funds, which collectively own 25% of many US companies. You may have seen many conspiracy videos pushing the idea that BlackRock and Vanguard own 25% of the world's company and are about to take over the world. And for the record, they aren't. When you buy an index fund, they buy the shares on your behalf and they hold them. But hey, that's not quite as an interesting a video title, really, is it? But anyway, over the past 3 years, conservatives in the US have joined in the debate, and they've been criticizing these firms for allegedly using their shareholdings to promote liberal causes, which they refer to as woke capitalism. And historically, regulators have permitted investment funds to exceed the 10% ownership cap on banks and utility shares, provided they do not seek a management role. However, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is now considering stricter conditions on these waivers. And while attorney generals in different Republican states have actually urged the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to reassess Vanguard's ability to hold significant stakes in publicly traded utilities. Vanguard's latest disclosures filed last week with the US Securities and Exchange Commission cautioned that they may not always be able to exceed these ownership limits in the future. And they actually said, it's not always possible to secure relief, and there's an increasing uncertainty regarding the extent of ownership limits relief that regulators will grant to asset managers like Vanguard. They also said, this makes clear the potential negative consequences a loss of regulatory relief would have on fund expenses and performance, as well as potential tax consequences for investors. They also said, we continue to work with policymakers to answer questions, address concerns, and minimize these risks. But hey, this is serious stuff. Actually, I think this heavy-handed regulation could hamper returns for millions of investors like you and I. Ben Johnson is the head of client solutions at Morningstar, and he said that the increasing size of the largest asset managers had inevitably ushered in a tighter regulatory scrutiny, and that the pressure would likely continue no matter who wins in the November national elections in the US. The chance of unfavourable rulings only goes up as these firms and their stakes in individual entities continue to grow. Jeff Damasio, editor of the independent Vanguard Advisor newsletter, also said on Wednesday that the days of index funds getting a regulatory free pass are over. Vanguard managing 100 trillion is a different beast than Vanguard managing 1 trillion. So, where does this leave you and I? Low-cost index funds are the mainstay of all our pensions. It's where we get certainty. It's where we manage our risk. And this is not only for those who can choose their own pensions using a SIP. If you've got a company pension, that'll also be based on low-cost passive index funds that will be affected by this change directly. So what do we do? I'm not sure there is an answer just yet. But we'll still be able to choose synthetic funds that actually try their best to mimic these funds that are going to be regulated. However, I'm not 100% convinced that this will give us the same level of comfort, really. I mean, imagine a synthetic fund is drawn up from derivatives by a fund manager. Well, you've got a fund manager making decisions there. Isn't that what we're trying to avoid when we buy a passive index fund? We're trying to take out them random decisions that investment managers will make on our behalf, fund managers will make on our behalf. We really want an index fund that does what it says on the tin. It just buys the shares and tracks them, not some complex derivative alternative. So it's not great news, this, and there's a lot of negative news coming around our pensions at the moment. So I hope it's not too depressing or too worrying for you. But I'm going to try and keep on top of this, and I will do some future videos as this regulation gets considered, really, and hopefully there'll be some changes before it really starts to up the costs for the pensions that we all hold. I hope you enjoy listening to this channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And if you thought this content was useful, please hit that like button, as it really helps the channel. Thanks.